Good evening. I think we'll try to get started. Hopefully there's some more space up here. There are a few more chairs here. Apparently there's an overflow room in room 109. If, for those of you who are standing over there, if you get sick of standing up or want to go someplace to sit down, I just wanted to make that announcement. I don't want to. I know the weather has probably slowed some people down, but I'm really pleased to see so many people here. I'm Diane Davis. I'm a professor of urbanism and development in the Department of Urban Planning and Design here at the GSD. This talk is partially sponsored by an interdisciplinary urbanism seminar that we are developing and building here at the GSD to kind of bring a variety of social science perspectives into urban planning and design and vice versa. I have the enviable task tonight of introducing a man who probably actually needs no introduction, because just looking at the size of the audience on a miserably snowy day in February tells me that, or demonstrates what's already known, which is that Manuel Castells' reputation as a scholar and a leading theorist of cities, social movements, and technology has traveled far and wide. We at the Graduate School of Design are honored to host him here for a lecture tonight. It is particularly fitting that Professor Castells is here with us to speak about his most recent book, titled Networks of Outrage and Hope, which focuses on social movements in the internet age. It was almost 30 years ago that another of his books appeared, also focused on social movements, called The City and the Grassroots, a cross-cultural theory of urban social movements, published, I think his first book originally published here in the United States, not a translation from other books he wrote. I was a student of Manuel's when that book came out, and we were just reminiscing yesterday about meeting you in a bar in San Francisco when you were doing the field work for that book. I can't believe that was 30 years ago. Don't start adding things up. That book won the C. Wright Mills Award from the American Sociological Association for the best book of the year it was published. And it brought to an American audience a relatively new analytical focus around which Manuel Castells had already forged an enviable reputation: the phenomena of citizen mobilization and activism at the level of the city, and the role that that activism plays comparatively and historically. That book focused on 16th century Spain, 19th century Paris, and a range of 20th century mobilizations in cities of Latin America, Europe, and the US. After completion of that seminal work, which built on but took in new directions the themes that he had already originally explored to great renown in The Urban Question and City, Class, and Power, which was, I really liked that book. I used that book a lot. While he was still in Europe, when he got to the United States, Manuel turned to a direct interest not only in social movements in the city, but then later in technology in the city. Maybe that was being in Northern California near Silicon Valley. I don't know, maybe you'll tell us more about that. Right, predetermined. Focusing on information technology in the city. And then he wrote a paradigm-shifting trilogy of books on cities, identity, and culture, and power in the information age. And after that, moved to other forms of communication. But now he's returned to social movements in a big way, and again, in a kind of virtual space and not just comparative and historical space. And his lecture tonight will allow us to see how he's revisiting the larger body of work on technology, power, and mobilization in the city. He's going to be framing that analysis through a focus on some of the most significant social movements that we've seen unfold in the last couple years, and the role that technology played in, or plays, in their emergence and fate. And so I'm really interested in hearing more about the arc of Manuel's thinking about social movements. It goes without saying that we're thrilled to have such an eminent scholar with us tonight. Manuel is author of 26 academic books and editor or co-editor of 22 additional books, as well as over 100 articles in academic journals. In addition to his scholarship, Manuel Castells has held distinguished appointments at MIT and Oxford, and is currently Director of Research at the Department of Sociology at Cambridge University and Fellow of St. John's College at Cambridge. He's advised governments and commissions around the world, including the European Union and the many, many commissions in the UN. And, oh, did I mention that he's been knighted for a cause of scientific merit by the governments of France, Finland, and Portugal? And in Catalan, I thought we were going to get to nationalism, you know. And yes, Barcelona won today in the game. Yeah, right. Manuel's very happy about that. But I think most notably that Manuel is the recipient of the Holberg Prize in 2012, widely considered the Nobel of the Social Sciences, given by the Parliament of Norway, and the Balzan Prize a year later in 2013, considered the most important general science prize, not just social science. Manuel is the only social scientist to have received both these prizes. He's a native Catalan. He studied law and economics at the University of Barcelona in Paris. He received a doctorate in sociology and a doctorate in human sciences from the University of Paris and Sorbonne. And presently, he's a university professor and Wallis Annenberg Chair in Communication Technology and Society at USC, as well as Professor Emeritus at the University of California, Berkeley, where he's Professor of City and Regional Planning and Professor of Sociology from 1979 to 2003. So, quite an impressive resume, but it's just great to have you here in person, Manuel. And so without further ado, I give you Manuel Castells.
Good evening. I am glad that you were trapped by the snow and you could not escape. But I do thank you for your interest and your presence here. I want to say that how grateful I am and how honored I am by this invitation from the Department of Urban Planning and Design and the GSD to give today a lecture, tomorrow a seminar, and I will do my best. I'm particularly happy to have responded to the generous invitation of my dear friend and colleague for many years, Diane Davis, who for me is one of the very best urban sociologists around in the world. And I hope that you will benefit from her input in this connection between spatially oriented planning and design and social sciences who understand the space and who understand that the space and society are intimately linked, intimately connected. We have been discussing with Diane for many, many years when she was a student, and we have continued over time, and we share one particular interest in terms of fieldwork in Mexico, which is actually a very fundamental country in many, many ways, and a very moving country, and which is currently in terrible situation, both urban and political. And it's exactly the moment when the scholars who were working on Mexico, we should strengthen our connection and keep working more with our Mexican colleagues who are in quite dramatic situation. And then I will lecture tonight about my recent work, which is on urban social movements, however, with a twist which I am presenting to you, not written, not been presented or discussed, on the implications of this kind of social movements for space and for the theory and practice of spatial forms and processes. So let me first start with a quick overview of the issues that I will be discussing, meaning social movements. We know that throughout history, social movements had been levers of social change, regardless of the outcome or of the content, and not normative in this. There are good social movements, bad social movements in normative terms, but they are major agents of social change. I would say the major agents of social change. They are triggered by always, historically and now, by emotions. Social movements are emotional movements that are shared collectively and become, from individuals, become a process of collective action through a process of communication between the different subjects. And so their forms of communication, organization, and action depend on the culture, technology, and institutional environment of each particular society and each particular spatial context. Indeed, social change is inseparable from spatial change. They go together. They interact. They are specific, but they go together. In fact, the urban form, all urban forms, result from the relentless interaction between the reproduction of this spatial urban form by the institutionalized interests and by the resistance and alternative project and counter-action by people, citizens who don't feel represented, who do not feel included in this automatic reproduction of the urban structure. So the urban form is urban structure and urban social movements interacting with each other. This has been my research agenda for all my life. So in this particular lecture, I will present and analyze the characteristics of the recent social movements that I call network social movements, and I contend that they represent the shape of social movements in the network society, our kind of society. And then after that, I will examine, or at least provide some hypotheses and ideas on the interaction between these network social movements and spatial processes. Let me first starting very empirically with recalling quickly some of what has happened in the last 5 years. I would say starting in 2009, in Iran first, July 2009 in Iran, and then Iceland and Tunisia in 2010. A wave of social movements has taken place around the world, not expected by anyone, not led by anyone, largely spontaneous, affecting literally thousands and thousands of cities over 100 countries. Although most of them were small in size and escaped to the attention of the media, but still, they have mobilized thousands and hundreds of thousands and received in many countries, in many areas, widespread social support, in spite of the lack of attention of the media and politicians. The interesting thing for me is that many of them display very similar characteristics in spite of the huge diversity of contexts where they take place. And therefore, methodologically speaking, I think that if they are in completely different contexts, unrelated among themselves, there are many similar characteristics of these movements, we are witnessing the birth of a new form of social movements, which is characteristic of our type of society. This is what I can say on the basis of observation. Observation, some by myself, some by my collaborators, some by a network of colleagues, activists, friends who around the world we have been interacting and sharing information. Let me just quickly mention some of the most important of these social movements. Tehran, July 2009. The 2010 kitchenware revolution in Iceland was a revolution, peaceful, but was. Then the Arab revolts that started in Tunisia in December 2010 and spread to Egypt and to many other Arab countries in the spring of 2011, and they're still going on in many places. Greece in 2010, still going on. The Indignadas movement in Spain, I say in feminine because that's how the movement calls itself, which is still, recently continues to have all kind of initiatives and actions in Spain, although it started in May 2011. Occupy Wall Street launched in New York in September 17, 2011, and that expanded in the following months with various intensity to over 1,000 American cities. I have the map in my book with the dates of the occupations. Israel in 2011, 2012, the largest mobilization of Israeli history, 500,000 people mobilizing the streets, setting up camps, etc. Moscow, of all places, massive demonstration in 2012 against, with always the same model, against the authoritarian regime of Putin. Portugal, starting 2011, still going on against the economic crisis and the management of the crisis by corrupt political elites. The socio-political movement of Cinque Stelle in Italy in 2012-2013, which has completely changed the landscape of Italian politics. Regardless of what we can think of Beppe Grillo, of the manipulation, that's it. I'm not saying great. No, I'm saying, look, a movement that did not exist, that is over the internet, and entirely changed the landscape of the corrupt Italian politics. Chile, since 2011, a student movement had been in the street with constant demands, and they have changed also the style of Chilean politics and the type of demands with the new president, Michelle Bachelet, who came to office in December saying, I will fulfill all the demands of the student movement that were there for 2 years. The Yo Soy el 132 in Mexico during the presidential campaign in 2012, according to many Mexican media, then, oh, not really. I was in Guadalajara a month ago. I was talking to them. They're extremely active in many different forms. Then the Turkish protests of last July that started for the defense of Gezi Park in Istanbul and Taksim Square, and are still very active, and they have provoked, again, a political crisis in Istanbul. And by the way, they won. Gezi Park is not going to be redeveloped. They actually won already. The massive youth demonstrations in Brazil in June and in September, I was there. I could watch, not my movement, but I was there and talking to them. Against transportation fares for better urban services and against political corruption, including the corruption of the FIFA. Can you imagine Brazilians protesting against the World Cup of soccer? That is a true cultural revolution. With the slogan, we change one hospital for 10 stadiums. You see, that's what I'm trying to underline, how truly different this has been. And even more recently, Ukraine, of all places, the popular uprising against Yakunovich. There are people from the right, from the left, from everywhere, but in the streets, with camps, with demonstrations, with no connection to the political system, they are completely redefining the relationship between Eastern Europe and the European Union, and it's still going on. In all these movements, there have been many different demands, and I will come into this later on, extremely different, and coming from different contexts. Crisis, not crisis. For instance, Brazil and Turkey have no economic crisis. Now it's a little bit slowed down, but at the moment of the movement, the economy was doing very well. There were, in Brazil particularly, strong programs of alleviation of poverty, a left-wing president, the left-wing political party more or less in power, and no economic crisis. The same thing in Turkey. Turkey is doing very well economically, very different from the United States and the European Union, even if there's a decline also of the economy in Turkey lately, but it's not Spain with 35% unemployment, or Portugal, or Greece with a total disintegration. So my point is that extremely different contexts, very different motivation, a whole array of demands, similar forms and similar features. One common, not demand I would say, by theme. And those of you who believe in the power of words, I think could pay attention to this empirical observation. They are, in all cases, there's one word that is repeated in Arabic, in Spanish, in Turkish, in Ukrainian, in Brazilian. The same word, literal translation, dignity. There are movements for dignity. When they are asked what you do, not when I ask myself, when the government asks, when the media ask, dignity. In Turkey, too. Right? So It's something else going on, because many different demands. But the key thing is the uprising against the social injustice perceived as a humiliation, a daily humiliation by the political establishment on their lives. When the young people in Sao Paulo started with a rise of transportation, and they were told, well, wait a second, there are a few cents. Well, first, they're not so few cents, you have to move all the time. But second, it's not about the cent, they say explicitly. It's for our rights, it's for our dignity. So keep this in the background. Now, I must say that the book that Diane mentioned and this lecture are very empirical, but they are not, of course, nothing is deprived from theory. The theoretical background of all this is the theory of power and counterpower I propose in my book, Communication Power, 2009. So if someone wants to do the exercise of related theory and observation, it's there. So let me first try to identify which are these common trends, the common trends that repeat themselves in all the movements, which form, therefore, a pattern of a new type of social movement. First, they are network. They are network in multiple forms. They start in the internet and in social communication networks and around the mobile communication, around cell phones and smartphones, which to some extent is linked to the new technological environment of our society. Just for you to remember one little figure, in 1991, the first survey of cell phones, of mobile phones, in the world, in terms of subscribers, not devices, subscribers, were 16 million people. Now is 7 billion people in a planet of 7.4. We are connected. We are entirely connected, of which the most recent projection for 3 years from now is 5 billion smartphones. That is, smartphones linked to the internet. And so the number of internet users now, which is at about 2.5 billion people, will skyrocket through the wireless connections and through the smartphones, therefore providing the technological and social platform for this kind of networking. And this is not an accident. Communication has always been central to social movements throughout history, where pamphlets, where speeches at the churches or at the mosque, where radio, television now, pamphlets. All the revolutions started with pamphlets and with written material and with rumors, as a matter of fact, as well. So communication is absolutely central. Without communication, there are no social movements. And the forms of communication, the technology communication, depend on what exists in every society. And therefore, these movements are networked in a different way, which creates incredibly powerful effects of rapid diffusion of the movements, and also debates, interactivity, and most importantly, communicative autonomy. Because most of these forms of networking electronic communication, even if they are owned by corporations, et cetera, increase extraordinarily the degree of autonomy vis-a-vis all the media institutions, government, corporate power, etc. However, I immediately say that networking is multimodal. It's not just networks in the internet. They start in the internet because it's where autonomy can be more directly stated. But there are social networks online and offline. There are pre-existing social networks. For instance, in the Arab revolutions, and particularly in Egypt, the networks, the offline networks of soccer fans were absolutely decisive in starting the revolution. The social networks of civil society, the personal and family social networks were extremely important. The religious networks of people formed spontaneously every Friday outside the mosque. But the interesting thing is all these different networks were connected in the networks, in the internet and in mobile communication. It's these networks of networks of networks that creates a meta-network, which is the form of the movement. Now, this networking capacity has two immediate decisive features. First, they have not identifiable center, and yet they ensure the coordination, because they can constantly connect and reconfigure themselves without a center. And therefore, they can relatively easily escape repression. No one to be arrested. They round up the usual suspects doesn't work here. Because actually, even when they do it, the usual suspects are not networks, are people. So the network themselves, they reconfigure themselves with, and they coordinate, they execute, they propose, they debate without necessarily having any formal leadership. So it reduces the vulnerability of the movement to the threat of repression, but something else, it protects the movement against itself, against the risk of bureaucratization, manipulation by its own leadership, destruction by endless debates on the essence of the movement that never lead nowhere and paralyzes the movement. So if anyone really becomes very, very heavy, always with the same ideology, it's just disconnected, and the movement continues. We could have done this in the Sorbonne in '68. However, to this first characteristic, a second and extremely important feature has to be added. Although they usually start in the internet social networks, they become a movement. They really become a movement by occupying urban space. This is the critical moment in which movements go from what I call outrage to hope. Because by occupying the urban space, they become visible. They become related to society at large. They can start deliberating and debating in this public space. And also, they start stating symbolically the claim they have over the city and through the city to society. Symbolic occupied buildings, symbolic squares, symbolic avenues, which at the same time are functionally critical. If they block the traffic in the Avenida Paulista in Sao Paulo, the whole megalopolis collapses. So the effects are immediately felt. But in addition, is also the notion, this is our city. The buildings, the squares, the transportation systems, this is our city. You have taken away from us. And in that sense, they are urban movements. They are urban social movements of the type corresponding to our kind of society. But they never leave the internet. They always live in the internet at the same time, because that's where they can survive when repression becomes harsh. And so this connection between the cyberspace and the urban space, which is the connection of and the form of the current urban social movement, is what I call the space of autonomy. It's a hybrid of internet and urban space. And therefore, I would not even go into the silly discussion about, did the internet create the revolution, not create the revolution? But that's silly. No technology creates anything. But the issue is how these revolts, social movements, oppositions, alternative projects exist materially. And this materiality is defined by the interaction, constant interaction, between the space of autonomy and the internet, the space of autonomy in the occupied space, and their constant hybridization. This space of autonomy is the new spatial form of network social movements. And it's a hybrid space, not virtual, not physical. It's both virtual and physical and in interaction. These movements are also at the same time global and local. They are local. They are always local. They always start locally. But they immediately relate, both in past and the future, to what's going on somewhere else. And they connect with other movements immediately over the internet. That has to be over the internet. But also they send people to do revolutionary tourism, which is one of the nicest tourists I know. And people say, hello, come, oh, sure. Everybody comes together. Well, some of them are policemen, okay, but anyway. In general, the movement immediately connects global and also they mark symbolically with words, with names, this globality, locality. For instance, in Barcelona, the main Plaza Catalunya, the main square of Barcelona, was immediately named Tahrir Square. In New York, Liberty Park was immediately renamed Puerta del Sol in one part of it, Puerta del Sol in Madrid, and another Tahrir Square. And so they recognize each other. They connect symbolically. We are part of the same thing. But remember, completely different contexts, cultures, motives, everything. But they feel that they are connected through this affirmation of dignity, this fight against the unjust, oppressive institutions that they do not recognize as their institutions. They are spontaneous, largely, in their origin. Largely. Not all, but most of them are spontaneous. And they are sparked with, they are motivated, originally they come from a spark of indignation that shows an image, usually an image that becomes unbearable. Image of violence, or at one point an information that comes about yet another corruption. In Brazil in September 2013, what happened was that after the movement had already started in June, but in September was reignited by the news that one member of parliament, of the Brazilian parliament, who had been sentenced for embezzlement of public funds and was in prison, actually serving sentence, he claimed the right to still be parliamentarian and receive his salary. And the Brazilian Congress vote for it. So you see, sometimes there are images, sometimes there are facts that cannot be tolerated anymore. Fed up, basta. You see, so that is exactly, this spark of indignation is what pushes a call to action from the space of flows in the internet, mobile communication, that aims at creating an instant community of practice of revolt in the space of places. And the power of images is fundamental. YouTube, people talk about Twitter. Yes, for organizing, for mobilizing immediately, but YouTube has been decisive because the images of brutality, of assassinations, of disregard for human life in YouTube have been decisive in many societies, including in our democratic California. UC Davis police using gas on the front of peaceful people sitting in the campus. So it's not just the machines, the machine guns of Assad. It's also the police in New York or in California who feel the right to do whatever they want. These movements also have another key characteristic. They are viral. Viral. This is fundamental. One of the most important characteristics of the internet, as shown by Professor Karine Nahon in her very recent book, Going Viral, is virality. Virality means, on the one hand, that every message in the internet, every image, everything immediately expands, immediately, and therefore is a constant platform of relentless communication of everything going in the world. But in addition, the movements themselves are viral. If you start in one place, any possibility of starting doing the same thing in another place emerges. The first demonstration in Egypt in January 26th of January 2011, the slogan was, "Tunisia is the solution." The sentence, again, is meaningful because it used to be demonstrations where Islam is the solution. That was the typical thing. They said, it doesn't mean Islam is not. They were multi-confessional and at the same time secular and religious. But the main thing was, we do like Tunisia. And in other place, in Syria, we do like in Egypt. And in the Arab Emirates, when they started, particularly in Bahrain, they started the same way. Always replicating, always relating, always, we are not alone in the world, it's the whole world, here we are. That's extremely important, this virality. Not organized by anyone. So therefore, you don't need a call, instruction, messengers. You don't need that a bad guy goes into the internet and before being caught by the NSA, sends a mysterious message that ignites everything. No, the normal internet, virality through the connection of the minds. The one common characteristic of the movement also in general is leaderless, in general. Not always. In the case of Chile, they have leaders, actually communist students. But they are leaders who accept the principle that the movement and the assemblies of the movement will decide, not their party. And they accept because otherwise they would stop being leaders in 10 minutes. Now, the deep reason why they don't have leaders, there are many people who try to be leaders. Of course, in any human organization, people say, hey, I'm the leader. But the movement systematically reject that because in their DNA is the rejection of the principle of democracy that is based on delegation of power to some persons. They don't reject democracy, and they don't even reject representative democracy. But they simply say, well, as soon as we delegate who we are to someone, this someone will do whatever, she or he, whatever with what we want to do. And so, no, we don't delegate to anyone. We control. Primitive anarchy? Maybe. But for the moment, I'm not trying to propose a new way to revolution. I'm trying to observe what it is. And the fundamental reason, they don't trust delegation of power because they have too many instances, and therefore in their collective imaginary, delegation is the road to betrayal. Important in the occupation of urban space is that it creates togetherness, not community, because the community is sharing some values, and in most cases they're ad hoc communities, so they're togetherness. Togetherness is fundamental. Why? This is even we know from neuroscience, because the most potent emotion in human life is fear. Societies are based on fear. Civilization is based on repression. Maybe good, but this is, in any case, the mechanism. And fear is only overwhelmed by togetherness, by sharing the fear. If you know that they are going to club you and you are alone, you panic. If you know that you are going to be clubbed with all your friends and people around holding hand, well, you panic too, but you don't run. You don't run because you are together. So they are also highly self-reflective movements. They interrogate themselves all the time. They debate endlessly who we are, what we want, why. It's that kind to restart the world, the whole world. Restart the whole world. And therefore, they go sideways in incredible deliberation. I have been witnessing in some of the Spanish assemblies heated debates about Heidegger. Well, it's true. Most of the movements are, in fact, semi-employed or unemployed college-educated people. But that's about, at this point in Europe, it's 30% of each cohort, so college-educated. But what I mean is that they don't start with slogans, with looking for a particular revolution. They try to think and understand. And according to what I have been told by some of my collaborators in the United States, is very similar. Now, a fundamental thing, in their origin, they are non-violent. They are non-violent, and they engage in peaceful demonstration. But systematically, they are confronted by repression, and repression is violent. Can be machine guns, can be tanks, or can be police batons, rubber bullets, etc. But repression comes, that's for sure. And the life and death of movements depends on how they handle the issue of violence. Because their only hope to transform anything is the support of the 99%. Is calling to the population at large. And in fact, they receive, in general, the support of the population at large. But if they respond with violence, it's a different thing. Most of the movements in the so-called democratic context don't respond with violence. There are some violent groups, particularly something called the Black Bloc, that is in every country. And the Black Bloc is a black box. It's made of young, violent anarchists, kids from the deprived neighborhoods, provocators, thugs, infiltrated police agents, is all at the same time. The moment the a flare of violence takes over in the media, because it's nice footing, you know, the media is going to report immediately, fire, blood, violence, and runs in the street. That moment, the movement is cornered. Of course, in the Arab revolutions, it's even worse, because at one point, they respond. In Syria, it started very peacefully, and for 6 months, against bullets, they did not respond with violence. For 6 months, 10,000 people were killed before that. The moment they responded with guns, nicely provided by Qatar and the United States and Saudi Arabia, then at that point, it changed. Civil war, like in Libya. The first victim of the civil war is the social movement. There's no social movements in the civil war. This notion that revolutionary violence, maybe, but it's not a social movement anymore. It's not a movement aimed at the transformation of society, becomes a revolution aimed at the transformation or at the seizing of power of the state, and to use the same violence in the other way around. So movements may start as movements, as social movements, transformative movements, and end up in civil war, and that point is a completely different logic of the apparatuses, logic of the geopolitical interests, and that kills the social movement. In principle, they are not programmatic. They have all the demands and no one is specific, and they are not channeled toward formal politics and political institutions, but they are very political in a fundamental sense. They actually propose and practice a direct, deliberative democracy based on network democracy. This project, in fact, is a new utopia of network democracy based on local communities and virtual communities in interaction. So it is a utopia. But you know what? Utopias are not fantasies. Utopias are material forces in our minds. All the major political transformations, political ideologies, political projects in the world are utopias, have been born as utopias. Liberalism was a utopia. Socialism was a utopia. Communism was a utopia, the form from the socialists, but was. And anarchy was a utopia. Grassroots cooperativism was a utopia. All these great ideas that people imagine to organize new forms of co-governance are utopias. So utopias definitely cannot be directly translated into the Constitution and made them operational, but are the materials on which we work to construct institutions and ultimately to live together. And then, so what? We have this movement, we have these characteristics, they are similar everywhere. This, what I said, is common to every movement, but the media, politicians, etc., always react the same way. So what? What they have actually achieved. Now, look at them, and they're just playing, and these are no serious things, how they can have a budget, how they can run the country, etc., etc. Well, here is the debate. It's a debate in the movement, a debate, an intellectual debate going on. From the point of view of the movement, often this debate about so what have you accomplished, is rejected as a productivistic short-term vision of social change. Say, well, we are not here to produce something, to determine an outcome. We are here because we cannot tolerate it anymore, and we are looking and searching for something else. And give us the time. The Spanish movement had an interesting slogan, we are slow because we go far. So the whole thing is about the time frame, the horizon. Which horizon? You are productivistic in the sense, are you going to be effective in 1 month, 3 months, 3 years, 5 years, 10 years? They don't know. No one knows. They move, but they don't have a deadline for the next election. That is an absolutely different, substantive difference from the other social movement. In my personal take on the matter of the effectiveness of social movements, of all social movements, I have a romantic theory of social movements. They all disappear, ultimately, by cooptation, repression, or, when they are successful, institutionalization. And they stop being social movements. So they're always going to die. But the interesting thing is not if they die or not. They do. But how they die, for what they die, what is their historical productivity of their faith in a way, not in 3 years. What happens, which are the seeds they plant in people's minds and in our institutions. That's, for me, the most relevant question. And from this point of view, the fundamental battle is decided in the minds of the people, in the minds of the people, not in the corridors of power. This is the derivative of what happens in the minds of the people. And for a while, like it's now in Europe, crisis of legitimacy, or in the United States, a huge gap in terms of crisis of legitimacy between what people think about democracy and their democracy and what is the practice and the representative democracy in place. A huge gap. There are all empirical data there. This is my current research project, so I know quite a bit about that. And then how this gap is going to be filled or not, it's a matter of the process. But these movements have been decisive in raising hope beyond the specific political institutions. In fact, many of these movements, in spite of everything, they have the support of the majority of the population. In Spain, Turkey, Brazil, Ukraine, Portugal, Greece. In the United States, it's more complex, but the last poll that I knew 2 years ago showed as many people, more people supporting the movement than opposing the movement. Okay. The majority were people indifferent or don't know, okay? But it's not the same kind of hostility that the media have or that the political establishment has. There have been many instances of institutional change, in fact, besides these fundamental questions. In Iceland, they changed the government, nationalized the banks, sent the bankers to jail, and they wrote an internet-based new constitution in which the entire population debated and approved the constitution. The Arab revolutions, we can say we don't like this or that, but impact, effect, yes, dramatic. They have changed completely the Arab world. And then we can discuss, and I welcome discussion about specific instances and then the positive, the negative. And in all my research, I'm trying, even if my sympathies are obvious, but I'm trying to be very analytical and non-normative, because not being a direct actor engaged directly in most of these movements, I think my contribution is to be as clear as possible in my analysis and exposure of what they are. In Iran, I was in London in 2009 when the movement exploded, and then exploded, and then the journalists in the press conference I was giving, they said, well, you see, yeah, but they are crashed. They are immediately crashed. The tanks, no more new Iranian revolution. Oh, really? It's different. These kids, because there were many of them were kids, are not trying to overwhelm the revolutionary guards. They're trying to do something else. Which something else? 70% of the population in Iran is below age 30, 70% below 30. 56% of Iran college graduates are women. And all these groups, all these people, in a country that has 1 million bloggers, by the way, and in which mobile communication is pervasive, they were the ones who were doing this particular movement that was crash, but not crash. In recent months, surprise, surprise, in the Iranian presidential election, Rouhani was elected, supported by these people, exactly. Rouhani is not revolutionary, but is in the line of Khatami. Is the kind of person who actually can relate to these demands of the Iranian civil society. And you know, among other things, world peace is changing because of that. See, the butterfly effect. Nadia is killed in the streets of Tehran, and suddenly, only 5 years later, we have a moderate reformist Iranian president without anyone having made this connection or anticipated. Turkey, the Erdogan government was the model Islamic government for all the West. Well, but it was a tremendously corrupt authoritarian government. It has been exposed by the movement. 2 ministers are in prison. There's a tremendous crisis. We don't know how it's going to was going to happen, but in a few months, in 4 months, the entire political system has been shaken. Italy, Cinque Stelle was got the largest vote in the last Italian election. Of course, all the others banded against Cinque Stelle, whose program consists in dissolving the Italian parliament and replacing by direct democracy over the internet. Crazy, right? Except 27% of Italians voted for that. And so on and so on. I could go into the specific. Then, specific demands. There have been important successes in a number of countries, and I will not go through my long list, but I can give it to you, including many local impacts in the United States from the Occupy movement. Look for this to different sources, but there's a major research network, Occupy Research, and Sasha Costanza Chock, professor at MIT, is here in this room and can answer all your questions about the local impacts. In Brazil, they have total success in transportation and urban demands. In Turkey, the urban redevelopment project was stopped. In Spain, the main issue, which was the mortgage law and the massive eviction, thousands and thousands, had been stopped, and so on. The political impact. Political elites usually refuse to even cooperate with the movements. And movements think that all political elites are corrupt and non-democratic. So it's very little chance that there is an avenue of transformation of this institution. But still, things move. So I said sometimes they move first by shaking up the political ground. In Greece, Syriza is now the main party in Greece. All the others band together against Syriza. But in Italy, Berlusconi ultimately was ousted, partly because of the new power relationships in the Italian parliament, largely linked to these critiques of the different movements. Although it's more complicated, that's why I hesitated. The most interesting thing is Brazil, where major country, where the president, Dilma Rousseff, a very progressive person, actually 2 days after the movement started in June, went public on radio and television and said, they are right. They are right. And yes, you are going to have all your demands. Brazil now is richer. You are right. And in addition, you are right in the fundamental thing, the corruption and non-representativeness of the political class. And you know what? I'm going to write a new constitution, changing the electoral law, and I'm going to put it to referendum, not going through the Congress. And she continues to take other initiatives. Her latest initiative is to start controlling the internet from Brazil, not to be under the control of the NSA. All these were demands coming from the free software movement in Brazil and from many of the activists in these movements. Now, let me finish for a few minutes on the urban and spatial dimensions of these network social movements. First of all, quickly remind you that many of these movements were linked in their origin to protest, not all, to protest linked to the urban crisis, certainly in the United States and in Europe, in terms of the trigger of the economic crisis, the financial crisis, was the crisis of the real estate market, the crisis of the mortgage financial system. That was the origin of the crisis. This was, in fact, the result of a completely speculative mode of development and housing production, linked to the direct connection to the financial institutions and the mortgage system, and the use, the massive use, high-risk use of mortgages as collaterals for all kinds of other investments. And ultimately, the crisis was when the real estate market collapsed. And therefore, many of the mobilizations have taken place as a response to the foreclosures and mass evictions in many of these countries, linked to the urban crisis, linked to the financial aspects of the urban crisis. Certainly in Spain has been a key issue and a most successful model of development. In other cases, has been the challenging of the model of the model of urban development resulting not from crisis, but from growth. This is clearly and explicitly the case of Brazil and the case of Turkey. It's also the case of Israel, saying this model of urban development, this organization of cities, this absolutely dysfunctional city life is not what we want. Development, yes, but not this development. So it's directly and explicitly a critique of the urban model of development. But then, at a deeper level, the occupation of urban space, squares, streets, buildings, is a fundamental expression of the movements everywhere and of all social movements. Remember, the old revolutionary tradition of the barricades. Yeah? You enclose yourself behind a barricade. That has no military or defensive use. On the contrary, you become the target. They attack you exactly there where you are. It's not the issue. The issue is that by being in the barricade, without explicit ideological statement or program, you define an in and out. You define who is with us is here, and the others, please join. And it's an exemplary action to rebuild an alternative space around alternative values and to feel the communal connection within the barricades as a way to oppose to the formal institutions which are spaces of exclusion in terms of the citizen rights. Moreover, it's also, in urban terms, the claiming of the public space, the most important issue in urbanism today, in my opinion. Creating spontaneous interaction, social life, fighting isolation and fighting fear, is creating instant public space, which is exactly the key issue in all the speculative processes of urban development. And you would allow me to take 5 minutes of theory, sorry. Connecting these practices, these processes to the theory I formulated in 1996, which I call the theory of a space of places and a space of flows. Because the old question in Urbanism 101, what is a space? Easy, right? And that's where you go crazy in your lectures. Because, of course, the space does not exist outside us. There is a space in nature. This is not our space. Space in human terms depends on the human practices. Is what humans do. Is a dimension of our existence. Is not outside us. Has to be defined in terms of social practices. So what is this definition in terms of social practices, which is what I would call a material theory of space? I went crazy myself too, of course, and then I found what for me was the beginning of an answer in an old letter written by the German philosopher Leibniz in 1715, in which he proposed the following definition of a space. I held the space to be something purely relative, like time. Theory of relativity, but of human relativity. Relative, like time. A space being an order of coexistences as time is an order of successions. For a space denotes, in terms of possibility, an order of things which exist at the same time. Let's call it simultaneity. Insofar as they exist together, and is not concerned with the particular ways of existing. And when we see these things together, and when we see several things together, we perceive this order of things among themselves. Okay, me not being a German philosopher, I simplified my definition of a space in terms of social theory and therefore of social practices as a space is the material support of time-sharing social practices. Space is the material support of simultaneity. Now, of course, throughout history, most of this simultaneity depending on contiguity, of being close, on being together. That's why cities were created and were formed. But then, all it was until the advent of the telegraph, in which you could be simultaneous, but at the same time at distance. And with the acceleration of technological change in distant communication, a new space a new space emerged, in which simultaneity or chosen time would not depend on contiguity, but on connectedness embedded in the flows of communication. And therefore, my point was, there is a space of places which is based on simultaneity through contiguity, and a space of flows in which simultaneity is based on communication networks. Now, originally, for me, the space of places was the space of experience, and the space of flows was the space of power. Because at that time, in the 1990s, the global communication networks were started fundamentally with financial markets, telecommunication connections between major corporations and ancillary networks, military networks. So they were really the spaces of power and secluded in terms of the airports and in terms of the global transportation system, etc. While the space of experience where people were holding out. And my point was, in fact, a major mechanism of power, imposing power on people's life, was power was run from the space of flows. People were living in the space of places. Their experience was all right, but all what happened in the space of places is determined economically, technologically, politically by what happens in the space of flows. Right? Wrong. Because, and I rectified as quickly as I could, because the good thing is to observe what happened. And what I immediately observed is that, well, these human species started to use for their own purposes, not for the power that be the space of flows. People for their sociality, people for their friendship, for their family, for their love relationships. They started to invade and occupy the space of flows. And then social movements, and then politics, and then everybody. And of course, the space of the power that be also tried to occupy the space of places by building major corporate centers, by organizing life at the level of the neighborhood, etc. And so, turns out that there is power and counterpower in both forms of space. But the critical point then is that to actually enact social change, any actor of social change has to connect the counterpower in the space of places with the counterpower in the space of flows. And that's exactly what these movements are doing. By claiming the public space for citizens, they need to construct a new form of space, the space of autonomy. The space of autonomy where meet the space of flows, the space of places, and the mental maps that people elaborate to reinventing the institutions that run our life. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, so we have like 20 minutes.
Only?
So we have to be out of here more or less by 8, so we have some time for questions. So I'll stand here and anybody want to start? Any questions? Rick? Yes, thank you.
I know it's too early to tell the full implications of the Occupy Wall Street movement, but if you could take a moment to compare it to the Vietnam protests. And one, I'm curious, I mean, my perception is that it's, even though I know there's a lot of ongoing discussion about income inequality, that the traction of the Wall Street movement is not the same as the anti-war movement. And I'm wondering the impact of Kent State and the violent protests and whether it would have been different if there had actually been a more violent clash.
Thank you very much. Well, yes, as you said very well, we don't know, and these things are longer term and depends on the permeability of political institutions. That depends on how scared they are about being out of power altogether. But for me, the fundamental changes in every way go through people's minds. Without changes in people's mind, nothing changes. And with changes in people's mind, there are some possibilities. So one of the things that the movement did, and we have all the opinion polls there clearly, is to put on the center of the debate, the public debate in the United States, the notion of inequality. It blew it up. This notion that 1%, and then we can, 1/5, depending which statistical calculation, but the notion that 1% would decide the lives of the 99% because they have the wealth, and therefore with the wealth they buy the power. That notion got stuck in people's minds. Even the politicians have started to say something about it, say, well, but we are going to solve it, trust us. But interestingly enough, the Davos World Economic Forum this year, I mean, at the end of 2013, had a survey on the global elites. Number one concern of the global elite, the extent of inequality. The global elites. Part of them because their wives told them, hey guys, you cannot do that. But part because they know that, if you start with this, the French Revolution could come. Because now the genie is out of the bottle. Everybody knows. That was a dirty little secret. Now it's no secret at all. And the internet is buzzing all over the world. No, seriously speaking, then they publish, Davos has published the full report of the actual inequality in incomes, assets, etc., country by country, including the United States, and showing that it's much worse than what the movement was saying. All right? And this is Davos. So my point is that there are mental and cultural transformation. The issue is, in any democracy, the actual transformation in policy terms that reaches people's life has to go through an institutional process. And this institutional process has been shaped by other interests, starting with electoral laws. The way we elect president in the United States is a total anachronism. Total anachronism. But it has a sense that responds to the interests of the two major parties. So as long as the political institutions control the way of reforming themselves, they are not going to reform themselves. That's why the Brazilian president, Dilma Rousseff, say, I'm not going to let Congress to do that. I'm going to try to do it directly with the people, immediately. Call to, this is presidentialism, this is anti-democratic, by the same people, of course, who were benefiting from this electoral law. Same thing in Spain. There have been some very good studies last week in which the two parties, the two big parties, conservative and socialist, together, in terms of direct voting intention, have about 22% of the vote. 22. Still, they would have the majority of seats in the parliament because the electoral law is there. However, in the case of European countries, you will see, I usually don't predict anything. I specialize in predicting the past, it's safer. That's why historians are always the most brilliant ones. But I have enough data, because that's part of my research, to say that the May 25th European election to the European Parliament will be a political earthquake in Europe, in which the traditional parties, right and left, are going to be completely cut off. In normative terms, probably the parties and candidates who will win more are the extreme right populism, okay? I'm not saying it's great, I'm saying it's unsustainable. And that part of this is the kind of public debate that has been ignited and regenerated by these movements all over the world. You decide.
Thank you very much for this optimistic talk. At this point, in the case of Turkey, which is the one I'm most familiar with, it is hard to be optimistic. And it seems there are all sorts of signs that things will get worse before it gets better. So I'll just mention two, because I'm interested in what you think of those. I mean, one is, you I'm sure know that the new internet law was signed into law by the president today, which seriously restricts internet freedom. You know, like the government is now able to remove any site in 4 hours according to this law, and internet providers are expected to keep a list of everybody's communication for 2 years. So this passed today. That's the first one. The second one, which is actually more deeper, is, as you said, with all these social movements, corruption is revealed. I mean, there are all these wonderful things that are happening. But in a recent poll, 72% of the population believes that the government is corrupt, but 45% would still vote for the government. So this is where I think the historical and structural aspects of the country comes into play. I mean, because what happened is after Gezi protests, the base of the ruling party is even more solidified, because precisely the kind of characteristics that you're talking about in the social movement, you know, the creativity, the leaderlessness, the secular, technologically savvy, etc. These are the qualities that the base doesn't have, and there's this almost like culture war. There's this hatred towards the kind of people who protested in Gezi. So it's hard to expect, at least in the electoral process, to in the short run, to see the. I agree with your longue durée optimism, but would you comment on the short term?
Thank you. It's so thoughtful and clear. Now, well, first, on a personal note, I am not optimistic or pessimistic in my analysis. I didn't say this is going to happen, it's not going to happen. I'm optimistic myself as a person, so my tone is optimistic. But sometimes I just predicted that the European Parliament is going to be full of fascists. So it's, it's not. So, but to take seriously your point, okay? So. The long duration thing that you mentioned is fundamental. Talking about Turkey, I'm currently writing an article with a Turkish student on the post movement. The government is, the first reaction of Erdogan has been extremely repressive, as you said exactly, and even trying to control the internet. The poor guy doesn't know he cannot do it. Even the first speech of Erdogan, as you remember probably, went to go on television and say, all this is the fault of Twitter. Like the social problem, political problem, don't see it, the fault of Twitter, right? So, but first, people are still using it. They are going to use it. And they are not going to be able to shut off the internet, because no one can shut off the internet, because it's like shutting off the electricity. Egypt tried 5 days, and they have to change that. Second, when the movement is already there in the streets and in people's mind, it's too late to shut off the internet, because the main effect had been produced. But what I absolutely take from your point is the more there is danger for the reproduction of the system of power when everything is closed and controlled, legally, institutionally, the more this system feels the danger, the more dangerous it becomes. And ultimately it's extreme violence, and ultimately can be Syria, not Turkey, fortunately. Still some democratic environment, the European Union institutions, etc. But Syria happened exactly that, with the great support of Russia. So Russia, China, and Iran say, okay, guys, kill as many as you want, no problem. You, at one point, you don't have weapons, we give you more. And money, we give you more. So yeah, in the short term, but the short term that for people maybe thousands and thousands of people killed, I mean, actually 100,000 people killed in Syria already. This short term, analytica sounds very nice to say, oh, the longue durée. But in practice, that devastates countries, people, lives, etc., etc. However, the most important thing for me in Turkey, and now talking specifically about Turkey, is that what appeared to be a completely self-protected system with no cracks, and had obtained the support of large segments of the population as an alternative to military dictatorship, including, for instance, many of the Turkish intellectuals. This is gone. I mean, only the hardcore or rural masses of the Turkish Islamic groups are behind Erdogan. But all the urban middle classes who supported Erdogan as a reformer are gone. So depending on how the electoral law works, but a large proportion of his support is gone. And the most important thing, the young people. The one thing that we know in terms of predicting the future, the only one we know is that the future will be the young people, right? So yeah, you could say, well, they will kind of cynical and demoralized as we are when they have all the responsibility. But you know, the way they are formed in their young age is different. At least they know very well how to work with Twitter, with social networking analysis, to coordinate among themselves. At least this is already theirs, okay? So I don't know, but all the information I'm having on Turkey, I have to go next year to check by myself, is that the ground has shaken and that nothing is going to be like before, including Gezi Park is there. They have not been able to destroy it. With all the promise of Erdogan, they would get it. And in many other Turkish cities, the project of redevelopment had been stopped. Of course, if they control the movement, they come back with the same developers, they will do the same thing. But for the time being, it's not gone.
Although they close the park
Well, but first they wanted to close it forever. So people now gather, as you know, in the streets around the park. Yeah. You decide, Diane.
Why don't we collect like 2 or 3, and then maybe you can...
Okay. So let me process mentally the 2 or 3 and articulate a theory around them.
Yeah, I'm wondering if you see cultural differences at work and the effectiveness of some of these movements. You described a lot about togetherness as a big factor of what happens when people are there. Lots of people had a great time at Occupy Wall Street, but lots of people also went there and found it inconvenient, annoying, irritating, slow, and hard to get things done. I wonder if you see a difference between some places where these movements have been more successful versus like a more individualistic American culture that just has a harder time enjoying being together.
That's very good. No, sure, I will not respond.
Hi. Well, thank you for a very thorough lecture. If I understand correctly, your hypothesis is that all these social movements that have spawned in the recent years are some kind of new social movement characteristic to our era. And you started by citing that they have many things in common, that they spawn in different places but have many things in common. I would like to ask you, one thing that I think you didn't address in your talk was how, in particular, these social movements are different from previous, like from the social movements of previous eras, because I feel, in a way, if you say there's all these common tropes, you can say, okay, this is because there's like a common base, or you could say they're just generic. In a way, I feel that the situation could be that we are in an era that allows for the the circumstance allows for the easy generation of social movements, but the social movements themselves are usually very generic, and this is biased by my own experience with the Chilean social movements, which I think are very entitled, are very sort of unreflexive, and in a way lack a certain consistency.
Thank you.
You're going to have to process a lot. Well, my question, I was struck by how positive the situation sounds. But I'm also often struck that in the study of social movements, people tend to focus on successful social movements. So I'm wondering, have you encountered some of these social movements that weren't successful? Or, and following on that, does the internet pose particular challenges, negative challenges to mobilization, for example, in getting people to commit? And related to that, also, all of these movements sound very positive, at least by some terms. And I'm wondering about the possibility, you mentioned that these are spaces of hope, but I always like this paper by Sherry Berman that traces the rise of the National Socialist Party in Germany to strong civil society and social movement activity. What are the potentially negative aspects of these forms of mobilization? Because of course there's a positive, hopeful side, but presumably there's also a more negative side, and I'm wondering if you want to say something about
No,
that.
you're absolutely right. Well, I answered the 3 questions, no?
I don't want to make you do too much.
Huh?
Yeah, go ahead, please. Yeah, I
Well,
know.
if I do it quickly, maybe we have 2 minutes. No, first of all, again, I'm really absolutely not normative. The tone is one thing. The observation I have had of all these movements it corresponds to what I have reported. If I would say that the most negative, basically extreme nationalist, chauvinistic, xenophobic thing at this point, for instance, in Europe, doesn't take the form of these social movements, but of political parties on the fringe, that they also use the internet, but they are not in this area. The only thing I could, in principle, I followed very closely everything. So the Ukrainian movement have some components of neo-Nazi ultranationalist groups. And we have to see where that movement goes, because there are many, many different factions there. But I would easily accept the hypothesis that any populist right-wing movement that uses the same kind of configuration, network in there, network here, also could be part of these movements. Absolutely. That's why, for me, social movements are simply movements that are trying to change the values and the culture of societies, one way or another, rather than seizing power directly and politically. That's the point. But certainly can be extremely chauvinistic and extremely reactionary social movements, and they are. But if we recognize the particular form in which this movement express, then it's possible to engage in activation, deactivation. Even in Italy, there are some elements in the Cinque Stelle movement which are not very clear in terms of their good intentions for democracy. So, but it's important to recognize that the forms of action, forms of organization, this is critical and this is common regardless of the ideology and purpose. Which leads me to your very well taken point. There are some elements which are common to the history of social movements. For instance, the centrality of communication, the absolute centrality of communication, the indignation, the immediate anti-establishment. However, what is different? Come on, what is different is the type of communication. It's not the same to communicate 6 billion people than to communicate the people around your parish. It's fundamentally different in terms of the size, speed, and complexity of the communication process that enables truly a deliberation and the construction of a public space which is three-dimensional. Is in the internet, is in the occupied public space, and is in the institutions that are submitted to this constant pressure. So this is not to say that the history cannot have some lessons, but the form, for instance, leaderless movement, no. All the movements, social movements in history were with leaders. That was fundamental. There are very few leaders in these movements, very few. And that's only possible because you can have a coordination through technological forms that ensure a distributed debate and distributed elements which are there. But more analytically and in scholarly terms, I would love that we start doing some comparisons with the history of social movements. For the moment, I do these ones, and then the historians will do the others. And then the last point about culture and individualism. Well, you know, just before the Occupy Wall Street movement, there was also this notion that I have heard from American friends and colleagues who were coming to Madrid, to Barcelona, talking, oh, this will never happen in America because we are individualistic. It happened, and actually part of the movement was linked really to some kind of communal feeling created there. Not everybody, of course. And in fact, in the Los Angeles movement that I know much better, there were very deep splits in terms of race, for instance. But there was a beginning of communal movement that started there. It's society. I don't think that we are individualistic societies and collectivistic societies. In Spain, people would say they are very individualistic. And in fact, there is an anarchist tradition in Spain, which is the expression of this extreme individualism. In Brazil, for instance, literally, when the movement started, I was giving a huge talk to a huge crowd of very established university students and professors, was not in the movement, and I was explaining a number of these things, particularly from Spain, and the Brazilian journalists there started at the end of saying, well, this will never happen here. We are a totally individualistic society. The door opens and the guy says, you know, the Avenida Paulista is blocked. We cannot go out, get out of here. So my point is that although it's, I would say, cultures specify movement, definitely. But we cannot characterize cultures in generic terms, individualism versus communalism or collectivism, because we are in a different model of sociability based precisely on the internet. And this sociability is what in sociology we have identified the process as network individualism. And network individualism is not the traditional form of individualism. I project my network from myself, but because they are mine, I belong to these networks. I can connect to other people, and it's in this interaction between a more communal, urban-based culture and a more individualistic, internet-based culture, that connection is where the interesting dynamics happens. At least it's some of the ideas.